Welcome to Special Topics, where faculty, students, and staff discuss daily news and how it relates to their teaching, research, and studies. Today's special topic is going to be on the connections between political science and journalism. Today we have some special guests in the studio with us, and I'd like to have them introduce themselves at this time. So let's start over here.
My name is John Van Benthuysen. I'm an assistant professor of political science, and my areas of expertise are international relations and comparative politics.
Okay, welcome, John.
My name is Tim Martinez. I'm a professor in political science. My areas of specialization are American government and political philosophy.
Sounds very interesting in these days and times. Okay.
My name's Taylor Powell, and I am a student at Black Hills State University, and my major is mass communications with a minor in political science.
Okay, welcome, Taylor. Glad you're here.
My name is Pamela Carriveau. I'm an associate professor of political science and sociology, and my areas of specialization are American politics and policy.
All right. We're going to be talking about possible connections or not between journalism and political science. And as the journalism professor on campus, I certainly do have some observations and ideas on that, but I would like to engage the political scientists here in a series of questions and that will lead into conversation to get their ideas as well as the student that is on the panel today. So, but first, could you just again tell our listeners some of your past and current research interests, just briefly, so that you've stated where your areas of expertise are, but your specific research that you conduct at the time or in the recent past, perhaps.
Well, I published articles that tackle the topics of international order and its relationships between state building and fragile and failing states.
Okay. Do you have material that you present at conferences then and publish on that?
For the past several years, I've been regularly presenting articles at the Midwest Political Science Association. This is a conference that meets annually in Chicago. And it's an international conference, which is nice because you get a chance to meet political scientists from all over the world.
Right. Okay, so at this point too, John, maybe you can just state, how did your interest in that particular area begin?
Well, as an undergraduate, when I was a political science major, a lot of the topics in the international relations classes was all of the wars that the United States had been involved with. And there seemed to be a common theme that at least in the post-World War II era, that a lot of these states lacked stateness. They did not have well-developed institutions. They struggled with things like economic development, infant mortality rates. They were fragile. They were weak. In many cases, they did not have governments at all, and that's what really kind of led me to the topic of international order and fragile and failing states.
Okay. All right. How about you, Tim, in your specific areas of expertise?
In recent years, I've written and had a few publications on the writings of the political philosopher Hannah Arendt, and more recently I've had done some presentations and publications on the writings of the French philosopher Élie Boudot. The reason I became interested in Boudot is kind of a spin-off from my work with Hannah Arendt's writings. They both have a similar kind of conceptions of what the public space for political action is. However, on one hand, Hannah Arendt seemed limited to me because much of her ideas were based upon a consensus theory of knowledge, where the knowledge of the political sphere of political action was limited to what we might now call public opinion. The writings of Élie Boudot focus more specifically on an attempt to use similar kinds of political action, in fact action of different forms, to try to establish some kind of philosophical truth that resides behind each of these areas. What he calls areas in which the political truths reveal themselves through actual events. Examples would, in politics, being things like the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and similar major events that he argues revealed certain kinds of truths about politics that can only be revealed through philosophy.
Okay, yeah, very interesting. Okay. How about you, Pamela?
Most of my research focuses on political behavior, and that ranges from the socialization we receive in public education.
Mm-hmm.
So I did some early research, or some of my early research focused on how kids really learn to be good citizens. And then after moving to South Dakota, there was a big kind of push in South Dakota as far as abortion bans are concerned.
Mm-hmm.
And then Dr. Comunero-Chilberg and I did some research on how do campaigns frame that issue in an attempt to engage with and kind of influence voters for those campaigns.
Mm-hmm.
And then most recently, I've been doing some things that look at textbooks and kind of coding and analyzing the kinds of images they use in order to tell a political story.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of subtle, but it's still pretty overt as far as, these are acceptable things, these are unacceptable things, and what kinds of images are used to tell that story.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very interesting. How about you, Taylor, as a student? I know you like doing research. She's our fact checker for Jacket Journal, BHSUmedia.com. And I know that you do some political reporting and story writing. What can you say about areas of political science and or journalism that you like to focus on?
Well, basically, I've always had a love for politics and discussing them, and I've always enjoyed watching how people talk about politics and the emotions that go into it and how that affects people's opinions. And so I've really tried to watch the news and figure out how people's views and how they grew up will affect their political views.
Their political views.
Yes. And so it's just basically observation and just diving into the news and trying to find my way through it. So.
Right. Okay. Very good. Okay. Next, I just want to lay a little bit more groundwork for a conversation, and that is to just ask each one of you to briefly describe how did your interest, and maybe some of you described this in the last question a little bit, but how did you initially become interested in political science? And then secondly, at some point, when or did you ever consider the connections between political science and the media?
A good question, because no one really has an opportunity to take political science courses in high school or junior high, and so the path to get to a political science major, I guess, is not clear or well marked.
Probably the earliest you have it is maybe a civics class I remember civics class, 7th grade.
And usually that's folded within a history program.
Yeah, it is.
It's the history teacher who teaches that. So, most students when they get to college aren't really clear what political science actually is. And I was the same way. I was actually a music major when I was an undergraduate. And I liked history when I was in high school, but I wasn't really enjoying my history courses because they were so myopically focused on the past, and I was really interested on not only the past but also current events, and as well as speculating about the future. And that's where political science steps in and provides a vantage point that is lacking, in my opinion, in other disciplines. And so disparagingly, sometimes political science can be viewed as parasitic or a kind of a scavenger within the fields of knowledge, because it borrows from so many different fields. So a good political scientist is going to have to be a historian, an economist, a sociologist, an anthropologist, you name it. It's more of a full spectrum discipline. And what I love about it is that you need to focus on the past, present, and it allows you to speculate in an informed manner, in my opinion, about the future as well.
Okay. And so in that way, you found that integrating with the media early on, or no?
Well, I think,
or not at all?
Journalism focuses on government and on politics, in addition to the weather and sports and all of these things. When you're talking about the meat and potatoes of, journalism, broadcast news, print media, it's government and politics. And so I think there's a natural, relationship between political science and the media, because so much of the media is focused on the political system and political issues.
Okay. Tim, your ideas on that? How did you become interested, just generally in political science? What was the, light bulb moment that you decided that was the way you wanted to go? And then secondly, how have you noticed the connections between political science and media?
Okay. Well, I guess I first got interested in studying government back when I was a kid. This is during the era of the Vietnam War, upheavals and the civil rights movement and all this stuff. So there's a lot of interesting stuff to watch, and that got me interested. But it wasn't until later that I took some classes in philosophy at the same time I was taking classes in political science, and I became interested in not just observations of how people behave, but also some speculations on why they behave or what they think they're doing, not just in terms of how they exactly act, but how they think, why they behave in a manner. Do they think they're acting justly? Do they think they're acting wrongly? And these kinds of more normative questions or ethical questions became more and more interesting to me.
Mm-hmm.
So and as an undergraduate, I majored in political science and also minored in philosophy. So, and the two were very, very close in my opinion. Part of it, I'm sure, I'd have something to do with the guy I had as my advisor as an undergraduate, very conservative old fellow. He really insisted on me studying everything from philosophy, religion, history, just like Dr. Van Benthuysen was saying. A whole range of things.
Mm-hmm.
And the philosophy and religion areas really hooked me. So I moved in that direction. In graduate school, I had a lot of interest in political philosophy, though I was warned, that as a political science professor going out on the market, as a political philosophy professor, you have a harder time marketing yourself than if you're a political scientist teaching American government. So I went in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
That's a long story. I've in a circuitous path, have gotten more into this area. But once again, what I find most interesting about this is being able to think about what people think they're doing in terms of justice, in terms of how they treat one another. Like I teach ideologies. I did as a graduate student, and I'm doing it in one of my courses as well. And we study National Socialism. Why did the Nazis do what they were doing? What did they think they were doing? And there's like and believe it or not, a normative or ethical component to even their thinking that might be totally wrong-headed and evil, etc. But nonetheless, I had an interest in that area of study. Now, how I think this ties in with the media is that you watch a presidential speech and you don't just simply count on how many times he says something or just simply analyze the text on the surface, but you also try to figure out exactly where is he coming from and what is his theory of justice that he's applying to try to advocate for the different policies that he is advocating for. This is the sort of thing I think is very important, that I find very interesting. And I think the media, of course, is the means of transmission between the world of politics, the political actors, and ourselves, means it plays a vital role through which we can understand what kinds of images, what kinds of ideas, etc., are being produced in the political landscape and something called the political spectacle.
Okay, yeah, excellent, good, thank you. Taylor, what do you have to say about that as a student? What do you see? You're a political science minor with a major in mass communication, focus in journalism, essentially, or integrated media,
Yes.
what we call it now. What are your thoughts on that? Why you've combined those two in a major minor kind of a situation at the university?
So basically, I became a mass communications major because I love to write, and I want to be able to get the truth out to the people. And so I always grew up talking to my mom about politics, and it was just a daily thing for me and her.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I figured out that I could have a career writing in politics and telling people this is the truth and trying to take out bias, that really hit me hard, just because I was like, I want to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think political science and journalism connect, just because without politics you can't really have journalism.
Mm-hmm.
And then without journalism, politics can go haywire and just kind of take over, and there's nobody there to keep them in check. And so I think it's checks and balances.
Right. So just on that topic, just really quickly, I'm sure you've heard of journalism as the fourth estate or the fourth power, and that commonly refers to the news media, especially print journalism or the press, traditionally, taking a watchdog role essentially over politics, especially in a democracy, and sort of a checks and balances way to keep the politicians transparent, upfront with the people. Now, that doesn't always happen in places that aren't democracies, but there are certain laws and rules that are in place still that don't allow journalists absolute privilege to get into politics, into certain meetings that the government feels that are inappropriate for them to have that information. Top secret information, high clearance types of activities. So how do you feel about that, being the fourth estate, taking a watchdog role with politics?
I definitely think it's a big responsibility, and it's not something that somebody can be like, oh, I have all the power. Like, journalists aren't here to have all that power. It's to give the power back to the people. And so I think that by being able to be the watchdog, that it is a hard job, and trying to figure out what the people should know and what might need to be censored is a very hard balancing act. And so it's just a lot of making sure that your ethics are always 100% and that you know why you're doing what you're doing.
And I should just mention, too, that the fourth estate idea has a bit of a history. It's not just specific to the United States. It actually began in Great Britain, and Thomas Carlyle, in his book on heroes and hero worship, explained that 3 estates in Parliament. In the Reporters' Gallery, there sat a fourth estate, more important far than the rest. So, very interesting. Also, the author Oscar Wilde wrote, in old days men had the rack, now they have the press. That is an improvement, certainly, but still it is very bad and wrong and demoralizing. Somebody, was it Burke, called journalism the fourth estate. That was true at the time, no doubt, but at the present moment it is the only estate. It has eaten up the other 3. The Lords temporal say nothing, the Lords spiritual have nothing to say, and the House of Commons has nothing to say and says it. We are dominated by journalism, and this is a couple of centuries ago already, wasn't it? When's Oscar Wilde? Late 19th century. So already this was being discussed. We talk about media being dominant these days, but it was already, the power of it was already being discussed. And I'm just going to add, too, before we go on to Dr. Carriveau, in United States, the fourth estate is contrasted with the fourth branch of government, a term that originated because no direct equivalents to the estates of the realm exist in the United States. The fourth estate is used to emphasize the independence of the press, while the fourth branch suggests that the press is not independent of the government and actually is essentially in cahoots with the government. Right? So I just wanted to talk about that a little bit while we were talking and speaking with a student that has the political science and journalism major minor. Dr. Carriveau, how did you get interested in politics? With your sociology background, that's a strong connection with the media, of course.
I feel as though Tim and John have these very eloquent explanations, and I have to tell you honestly that it's because I grew up watching LA Law, and I thought I wanted to be a lawyer.
So from pop culture, you got this idea, of course.
And being a lawyer seemed like a very grown-up thing to do when I was thinking about, what to do with the rest of my life. And a lot of people said, well, if you're going to go to law school, you should be a political science major. And then I got into political science and realized, I kind of like this better. Although I do, in addition to American politics and policy and that kind of thing, I kind of specialize in the judicial branch as far as the things that I teach on campus. And I also decided I'd much rather do this. This is much more fun than writing briefs or trying to go over contracts or billing 80 hours a week as a lawyer. So as a junior in college, I decided, no, I want to go to grad school as a political scientist, and said thanks, but no thanks to the law degree.
Do you ever think about what you could be doing if you'd followed that law passion?
I am perfectly happy with the choice that I made. I still may be working 80 hours a week, but
I'm glad you said that.
But I can grade papers in my pajamas if I want to.
Right. Have any of you thought about running for political office?
Absolutely not.
No?
We study government and politics, and that doesn't mean you want to be one.
Right, okay.
That probably predisposes you to not.
Yeah.
And why is that? Just in a nutshell. I mean, I'm sure there's a ton of reasons, but why no way?
Well, when you're a student of politics, you come to realize very quickly that even in a democratic society where, essentially you're exchanging bullets for ballots, that politics is a knife fight, and it is very much conflict-centered. It is a mechanism in which, societies can avoid the bloodbath that comes with disagreements. And so I would like to think that, a disposition that, favors going into the field of political science is you like to observe things, you are fundamentally dispassionate, and those things are not good political characteristics for someone who needs to kind of survive in that cutthroat environment in which, you have to be, extremely passionate and opinionated, the pretense of objectivity is inappropriate in the realm of politics, where you are partisan, represent a specific worldview or interest or constituency. And that's very different from the mindset of political science.
Yeah, and of course you become a public figure. And so in terms of the media, you are out there. In terms of how you're talked about and depicted in the media, whether it's cartoons or roasted on a comedy show, or you have to be able to handle all of that as a public figure.
And political scientists, they like details, they like nuance, whereas I think in the media, the tendency is to distill things into a soundbite, into its simple essence. Which makes sense in that type of medium when you're trying to convey a lot of information very efficiently. But political scientists face a different incentive structure, much more granular in its look at politics.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
I'll just say this much, that the study of politics, I fall back on Alain Bedeau, the French philosopher that I studied some recently. He believes it's the role of the philosopher to be sort of an observer, and I put a political scientist as well. You observe what takes place out in the political realm, and you wait anxiously for events to take place that, maybe put it this way, is just these are the events that change the course of human history. And of course it has a lot to do with the in-between, but it's important to identify those key events and articulate the truth that comes from them. And that's quite different than actually practicing politics. And again, I don't mean it necessarily disparages the role of a politician or an actor in government and in the political realm, but it's certainly something that we're not, at least I personally am not equipped to do. I'm more of an observer, not an actor. And, whatever reason I can't do it, and I'd probably make a mess of it if I tried.
Yeah, it's complex.
I think my focus on policy puts me in a little bit different position compared to, say, focusing on IR, comparative or philosophy. People who focus on policy their interest and their passion is in building a policy that works well for whatever you're trying to accomplish. So I actually think I could see myself running for an office like a school board member or a city councilman, or even once we retire a state legislator. I think in South Dakota we have an abundance of, what we have is an amateur legislature, which is fine. There are some benefits to that.
Meaning that these people don't really have a political background.
Right, they're not professional politicians.
They have come from a variety of backgrounds.
It's their part-time job. In fact, they'll often spend the week in Pierre, and then they'll go home and do their real job during the weekends. Okay? There are real benefits to that, but at the same time, there may be a lack of understanding of how complicated politics can be and policy can be. And so I think there's some value in political scientists or academics in general getting involved in that policy aspect to provide the expertise that is needed when making complicated decisions.
Right. Did you want to comment on that, Taylor, at all?
Well, being a mass communications major, I wouldn't run for an office or anything like that just because I'd have to make sure I stayed unbiased and didn't become loyal to one party over another.
Right. And just on that note, when we do study law in media, we do know that journalists cannot hold a political office. They cannot stand up in front of a crowd or anybody for that matter and take a political side. In most cases, it's not really a legal issue, but it's more of an ethical issue with the news organizations, and commonly the news organizations have clauses in the contract saying that those people would be released from their job position if they did such a thing. Now, sometimes we have to question that, right? When we look at political pundits and who are journalists who are on certain television programs and certain television channels, which seem to be somewhat, the journalists themselves sometimes often appear to be rather subjective in their views. And so that happens these days. But those that are true objective journalists, people that want to get the truth out, certainly do try to avoid bias in those ways. But as we also discuss, it's very hard as a human being to avoid bias. So we always have to be very aware of that. But no, I commonly see, though, and I've commonly known journalists who will have reported on politics for quite a long time decide that they're going to put their journalist career on hold, and then they will step into politics. I have seen that, especially at a local level. Not as much necessarily at a national level, but I've seen that happen at a local level because now now, as a journalist, they've seen all kinds of settings from A to Z. They have talked to so many people in the various classes that exist, working class, lower class, middle class, upper class. They've had access to so much information that they now feel that they can enter politics and make a difference that way instead of making a difference through journalism. I want to just throw out a statement here, and I know that John's going to have to get going here, and I'd like to get this out there a little bit for discussion before John has to go, and have him comment if there's anything that was, that you really wanted to say and didn't get a chance to say. But I do want to throw out this statement, and you don't have to agree with it, but I just thought it would start some conversation. We could say, we don't have good journalism like we used to, and we're wondering if that's because we don't have good politics like we used to.
I guess I would disagree with that statement. It's subjective, obviously. It kind of depends on who you're asking.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of getting back to that issue of, bias in journalism, I think it's unavoidable. There's political science, and especially in political theory, there's that famous statement that there is no view from nowhere. Howard Zinn kind of encapsulated this kind of the meaning of this phrase when he said famously, you can't be neutral on a moving train. And so in the United States in particular, we have always had an intensely partisan press, with the possible exception of what is sometimes called the golden age of broadcast media that existed from the 1950s roughly into the 1970s. But that was more of an anomaly. If you go back to our history, it was not unusual for political parties, indeed for individual politicians, to have a hometown paper that represented their particular views or a particular party's views. So Andrew Jackson, he had his own friendly press, and this was the norm. Mm-hmm. We had, sensationalism, yellow journalism in the late 19th century. William Randolph Hearst, and from some perspectives viewed as a warmonger, galvanizing U.S. support for the Spanish-American War. And so, our history of a partisan press is well established. I think we miss, or a certain generation of Americans miss how the news media existed from the 1950s and 70s. This is when, outside of radio, we had basically the three major broadcasters, right? And you could watch any one of them, and you were essentially going to get a very similar narrative. And this had a unifying effect, I think, on American politics of the era, with the exceptions of the Civil Rights Movement, obviously. But, Americans, we shared a common worldview in many respects, and that began to change with the advent of cable news in particular, and especially with the internet, has just kind of blown up that traditional media market. And so instead of having a common narrative that we get from three media sources, now there's you name it. There's going to be media viewpoints all along the political spectrum, from the far right to the far left, and everyone kind of is self-seeking their own worldviews to have those views echoed back at them. And here we are. Back with a partisan press, which I would argue is more in keeping with our history than that brief interlude of a nonpartisan press, I guess you could say. Although even that kind of designation as a nonpartisan press is questionable, because major media outlets have always kind of served corporate interests, just because so much of their funding model relies on advertising revenue. So naturally speaking, you are going to want to not alienate who is funding your media. And so,
Yep, that's how you pay the bills these days.
Exactly.
Well, a lot of journalists that I see getting into the field don't really realize that. They don't realize, they're not thinking essentially that their bread and butter essentially is going to come from advertising. Their salary, the place that they work at, that comes from advertising, and that right off the bat can lead to bias from that news organization. And so I know a lot of journalists that get into situations like that they weren't anticipating, and then they have to make decisions about lifestyle, etc. What kind of advice, based off of what you just said, John, would you give, like a student like Taylor, who has a journalism, integrated media major with a political science minor, with the goal of getting out to be the watchdog over the government? What could you say to a student like that?
Be prepared for a lonely fight. With very diminished and limited resources, because increasingly with the internet, we have an explosion of blogospheres, right, and online internet sources.
Social media.
Exactly.
We have the President of the United States doing Twittering every day.
Yes, but, where does a lot of the information come from in which all of these news sources are talking about? They are still always referencing print journalism. And so we have a media environment in which news creation is shrinking, but news delivery is increasing. So the food chain, the base of the food chain in the media is becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. So it's almost like an inverted pyramid, where it used to be a pyramid with a strong kind of robust base of well-funded print journalism outlets who could fund and staff foreign bureaus, who could pay for the high cost of investigative journalism. Those resources are dwindling at the same time that the number of media outlets is expanding. And so, we're very much in a revolutionary time when it comes to the media. So I guess the prudent piece of advice would be adapt or die.
Would you say that the press is the enemy of the people?
Absolutely.
Right now?
Obviously, that's a historical statement that is associated with movements of anti-Semitism and National Socialism. A dangerous statement in my mind. You cannot have a free society without a free press. There's a reason why the founding generation included in the very first amendment of the Constitution the freedom of the press. If it wasn't important, it wouldn't have been in the First Amendment.
Okay, very good. Taylor, do you want to respond to that directly, since we were just talking about your major? Then we'll go back to Tim.
Yeah, I mean,
comments, ideas, anything that you want to say at all.
Okay, I definitely agree with John, and the fact that you brought up blogging, and just there's a lot of amateur work out, and that's what everybody uses. When you go on Facebook and see all the news clips that people have posted.
Like the citizen journalist.
Yeah.
Or the amateur journalist.
Yes.
Just like Dr. Carriveau was talking about the amateur politician, kind of related back to my original statement about good politics, good journalism, bad politics, bad journalism. But go ahead.
So the news that people are gathering now are coming from bases that aren't as stable. And so it's maybe somebody that isn't as expertise in the area of journalism and whatnot. And it's just opinion, and it's not like looking into the facts and trying to get the facts out. And so I definitely think if you don't have good journalism, politics will also start to fall apart because you're not getting the truth. And then also if politics are not doing well and all the politicians are lying and whatnot, it's a really hard job for the journalists then, because how do you create good journalism? So.
Do you think that politicians that lie do it because they know they're being monitored by journalists or the media? Is that causing them to be non-transparent? Is that a cause or a contributor to a politician being non-transparent? Because they don't want to say everything to the press. They don't want to be transparent.
I mean, if I was a politician, I know I would try to say the truth, because I wouldn't want a journalist or fact checker to be like, oh, well, this is the actual truth, and then that makes me look bad. Fact checking all the politicians, that should make them want to tell the truth.
But are there times, political scientists, are there times when politicians need to withhold information and be strategic, even in a democracy?
Well, what's the most important goal of any politician? They're supposed to say, when asked, what is your purpose as a representative of the people, they're supposed to say to defend the Constitution and to represent their constituents. But very frequently, they will be caught in unguarded moments, not thinking about their responses carefully, and they say to win re-election. And this is
has that become a big goal?
It's been the time-honored tradition of politics, right? Politics, you can't divorce power from politics, and engaging in politics is very much associated with the pursuit of power. And any politician, their highest priority, whether they say so or admit it or not, is going to be to win re-election. And very frequently that requires not telling the truth.
Yeah, power always strives for secrecy. I mean, go back to Plato's Republic, and you have a magic ring that can make you invisible, and Plato describes the abuses occur because of that. And Rousseau talks about similar things all the way up to James Madison and up to now. The power always wants to be invisible. It's everything, even to do the benign good thing. It's easier to do it when no one's watching. If someone's looking over your shoulder, it's harder to do it. And then if you're up to no good, of course you don't want anyone to know. So there's always been this pattern throughout human history to operate in secrecy. So I would say it's nothing new. It's not because the press is making them do it. They're doing it because they want to get away with something.
Okay. Would you equate, Tim, back to the original statement, would you equate good politics with good journalism or bad politics with bad journalism?
Well, you need to have good journalism. And I'd say, and people usually say in reference to a democracy, you have to have good journalism. I'd argue in any kind of non-authoritarian, non-totalitarian kind of government where you can limit power, power has to be exposed. It has to operate as much as possible in the open. That'll check it. That'll keep it under control, because if it's not the people, someone else at least will check it and prevent it from being abused. But if it can operate in secrecy, and that's why you need journalism. That's the basic function.
And this is where economics kind of enters the picture today, too. You can't get around it, I think, without discussing that a little bit. But we have currently in the mainstream media, what we call mainstream media, that catchphrase, the big media industries, we have 5 or 6 main industries, monopolies, oligopolies around the world. And it's trickled down all the way to the local level, to local TV stations, to local radio, to local newspaper, to local book publishers, all the way up to the big ones. And they're huge corporations and industries. And so as journalism and integrated media students move forward in the program, they have to discuss these kinds of issues very critically and pick that kind of activity apart, knowing that, like Taylor here, she wants to get out there and get the truth out. But what happens when she goes to work for a paper like the New York Times or the LA Times or the Houston Chronicle that's owned by a big conglomerate? And from a business standpoint, from an economic standpoint, in order to get certain advertisers and in order to maintain their income, essentially, and their profit levels, they want to do these kinds of stories instead of this kind of stories. And so those are the options that they give some of their reporters. And we call it hegemony. Hegemony of the big media, so that we discuss that in a lot of our media issues courses where we discuss law and ethics. What if media is a bigger power than the politicians, than the government? I mean, do you think that could actually be happening now? I mean, could the media be bigger than the government? Or are they on a level playing field, or is government still in charge? Who runs who, essentially?
Good question, but I'm going to have to leave.
Do you want to just say one more thing before you go on that?
Well, I mean, I guess, I guess you could make the argument that at one point in our history, government had the upper hand in its relationship with the media, and that was in the New Deal era when we, under the, FDR administration, we had the passage of the FCC, in which rules were put in place to guard against media consolidation. But that changed in 1996 with the Telecommunications Act under the Bill Clinton administration, in which those rules were scrapped. And so it's no accident that in the years following that, that's when we saw, groups owned by, like, Rupert Murdoch is a well-known example, coming in and going into a media market, snatching up, a radio, broadcaster, a TV show, the local newspaper, and really kind of consolidating their ownership of all avenues of the news. And so in this day and age, I believe it's, corporate interests that really kind of have the upper hand. And I wouldn't characterize it as government and media. I would characterize it as government and corporate interests with the media in between, trying to kind of, navigate, their precarious existence between those two entities.
Okay, very good. All right, so you need to take off. Okay, so we're going to excuse Dr. Van Benthuysen because he has to go to a meeting. So thanks for coming.
It was a lot of
Appreciate
fun.
it. Thank you. We'll continue on. Now, Pamela, would you like to talk a little bit? I mean, way back to my original statement. I don't think you've had a chance to even address it. Good journalism with good politics, bad journalism with bad politics, and then anything else in between that these panelists have been discussing?
Well, there were a couple points. One, Dr. Van Benthuysen mentioned that ultimately a politician's goal is to get him or herself reelected. But if we go back to our Madison, as articulated in the Federalist Papers, Madison foresaw that.
And what era was Madison again?
We're talking about framing of the Constitution. He's known as the father of the Constitution.
So late 1700s.
Right. He was the 4th president. He anticipated that, though, and he said, you know what, our politicians are going to want to get reelected. That's the main power we have over them. And that's okay, because we'll use that to control them. They'll have to do what we say in order to get themselves reelected. But the key is, of course, the only way that we'll know whether they're doing what we want them to do or not, is if someone tells us. And I think that's where the press come in. They're the ones who have to keep track of what politicians are doing, and they have to inform the citizens. And then, of course, I think where it falls apart is the citizens have to pay attention and then care and vote appropriately. And that's perhaps where Madison's theory falls apart, but that's through no fault of either the politician who's behaving rationally or the press who are doing their jobs reporting what a politician is doing.
Okay.
I was also talking about whether it's good media, good politics, bad media, bad politics, or who has more power today. I think it's a little bit misleading perhaps to even think about media as if it's this unified whole. I mean, I think that's the real key. Media isn't unified, and you can probably find a media outlet to support whatever argument you want to make as a politician.
And we see that happening.
Exactly.
We see that happening very commonly today.
So,
well, even currently, we have our top government officials have decided which media that they will speak with and which
right.
will be barred.
That's right.
So they do make those decisions, and there is no absolute rule on that, who can come in and who cannot.
So to this idea perhaps that the media has more power than the politicians is probably misleading, because it depends on which media we're talking about, and there will be an oppositional media as well. And the same thing with the politicians. Even if they have a media outlet that is sympathetic to their cause, you know they're going to have one that isn't. And so I think we have effective checks on the power. Now again, I think the disconnect or the problem with the system is whether the citizens pay attention and care.
And care.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
right.
then act based on
and you
that
hear a
information.
lot that they don't.
That's right.
They just don't care. On that note, I just was reading a piece by Bill Moyers, who is a journalist, and in recent years he's been working with PBS. He's been writing a lot, and of course, just like so many other professional journalists now, a lot of his work comes out on social media. People follow him on social media, and instead of reading him in a newspaper or watching him on PBS, he just puts out work all day long out on social media, out on his Facebook account, etc. But he talks about this correspondence dinner, the White House Correspondence Dinner, is an unhealthy display of coziness between reporters and those they should be skewering. So he titles it The Unholy Cohabitation of Press and Politicians. It is interesting. It's kind of ironic that they have this celebration every April. The current president of the U.S. has decided not to attend the Correspondence Dinner for whatever reasons. We don't know the reasons. He didn't state, I guess. Just said, everybody go and have a good time. I won't be there. And then there's this picture, of course, of politicians, and must have been at one of the correspondence dinners with President Obama, because I see President Obama in here. So there's some politicians here, and there's some journalists here, and they're all kind of got their arms around each other, and they're posing for a picture up on the stage. But we do know that these are the same politicians and the same journalists that do sit in press conferences, and the journalists commonly grill the politicians in the room, whoever happens to be standing up in front at the time. Maybe it's the President of the United States, and they throw out their questions and try to get the information. So it seems collegial, but at the same time, there's some tension there. And then they have this dinner every year where they kind of get together and let down. I guess they go and have a good time, and they don't ask a bunch of questions and stuff and just kind of call it a level playing ground. Do you want to comment on that at all? Maybe this will bring up something. The distance between the press and the politicians it covers should be wide, and rubbing shoulders with the politicians is all too likely to promote a mutual self-interest that overwhelms the public interest. That's true no matter who the president is. Long before the current president, the dinner had become symbolic of one of the big problems with the media. They are too close to power, too chummy with the folks they should be skewering. Any comments on that?
Well, they definitely should be distanced from them.
Should they be eating together at the same dinner and hugging each other on the stage?
No, not at all. That's not the function of journalism or the press. Sometimes referred to as critical distance.
Critical distance.
You get too close to that thing which you're trying to study, and you become, in a sense, captivated, if not captured by it, and you, in time, begin to share the same values, same characteristics, and you lose your objectivity.
Right.
I think the same thing applies with the press, with the news media. They have to maintain that distance. They have to have built-in skepticism, and that, of course, is going to lead to them being in the you-know-what for politicians. And the problem they run into, like in the White House press corps, is they're shut out if they show too much of this criticism. The press secretary controls who's going to get called on, and in fact, even who's going to be there.
Right.
During press conferences. So if you're too critical, they'll just shove you out. So they have to be careful not to bite the hand that feeds them.
Right.
There's also examples of being fed news stories, little gems by the president's press secretary. If you're real nice to the president and, of course, the press secretary, they might be more likely to slip you stories and get a scoop on everybody else. So you have all these incentives to behave nicely to the president. That's why what's happening right now is kind of interesting on a certain level. Today, the press secretary and the president have very hostile relationships with the media, which I'd say actually is a good thing. Problem is what they apparently are doing now is the press secretaries giving access to specific news organizations. Like I think Breitbart has been one of the ones.
And some of the news organizations are known to be more subjective rather than objective. That's part of the problem as well.
And so they're finding the news outlets that will tell the story they want them to tell.
And that's a total public relations approach, which journalists commonly grapple with these days. Here at BHSU, I oversee both programs, public relations and journalism, and skill levels are the same, but approaches and philosophies to the job are one end of the spectrum to the other. So, and these days, sometimes we see those things combining, though, and that's where sometimes journalists end up doing public relations stint when they really want to do journalism. You want to comment on that a little bit, Taylor, as a student?
On the article that you just read?
Yep, any of that.
I definitely think that it's towing the ethics line. It's your job, like a journalist's job, to go and report. And, you have to, once again, every single step a journalist takes has to make sure that it's in their line of ethics. And it is nice to be able to get stories if you're buddy-buddy with the president, but that's not your job to be friends with the president or any politician. If they're doing something wrong, you're going to need to tell the people. And so I definitely think that something like that, journalists and politicians have to be careful with going to dinner and hugging and just trying to be friends and whatnot. So I just think it's unprofessional.
So what do you think about the current state of the relationship between the federal government and the media and the statement that's been thrown around that the press and the media are the enemies of the public? When you hear that or when you've heard that, what do you think, being a political science journalism major minor?
I think the first question that pops in my mind is, why? Why do people think that the press would be your enemy? Because, I mean, some journalists, of course, are friends with the people that they're supposed to protect the people from and whatnot. But most journalists, I mean, I feel like if you're a true journalist, you're going to try to get the truth out. And so why would the people want to turn their backs on the journalists? Because then you look at places that have a bunch of censorship and no journalism and it's completely overrun by the government.
So when you go into situations, you just want to go, you have to have focus to go in and get the story and kind of brush that stuff off. At the same time, you may have people that you need to talk to that will be very wary about speaking with you just because they've heard that media overall is stereotyped as an enemy of the people. So they see you commonly as a threat sometimes, and then you can't get the information that you need because they won't speak with you. Problematic situation sometimes that you have to think about how you're going to work through this and the kind of relationships that you have to build with people to get information in that kind of environment that is downplaying your role as a journalist that wants to get the truth out and not be an enemy of the people.
Yeah.
Dr. Carriveau, do you have something that you want to say?
Yes, please. Can we consider the source of that comment?
Of course.
Please. It wasn't people who said the press are the enemy of the people. It was the politician who said the press are the enemy of the people. And if anything, that should indicate to the press and the people that the press are doing their job.
So that's a healthy environment to be in.
Yes.
So that's where it almost says like, I don't know if we can say it this way, but good journalism, bad politics instead of good to good. It'd be good journalism, bad politics, bad journalism? Instead of bad politics, bad journalism, good politics, good journalism?
I'd kind of like, I'd hope that if we have the press doing their job, good journalism, that we'll end up with good politics.
Okay.
Because we're holding the politicians accountable. We're informing the citizens so that they can make good choices. And the politicians know that we're paying attention, and so they have to behave themselves.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, very good. Did you want to comment on anything more on that, on Dr. Martinez?
I'll just make the comment about when the press became the people's enemy. I think the president is tapping into a prejudice in part of our society, not trace that in part back to the Vietnam War. Journalists became the enemy of the troops in the field. I had a number of people I know, that students who were Vietnam vets, bring up the media and they just get, these people betrayed us.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a watershed event in American journalism, and where the press became, this period Dr. Benthuysen talked about, kind of the golden age.
The golden age, yes.
50s, the 60s, and then you had the Vietnam War, and drove a wedge between the press and a certain segment of our society. Politicians have always been hostile to the press, I would argue, mostly for a long time. But the people began to see it as an enemy in the 70s, and it's carried forth into the present time, where the president wasn't just speaking into a vacuum, just saying words that no one hears or responds to. He was speaking to his base.
Mm-hmm.
And his base heard what he said, and that kind of light goes on in their head and go, oh yeah. And some of them maybe are Vietnam vets that remember that, and they go, aha.
Mm-hmm. So that would be one of the audience members that would totally pick up on that and agree.
A lot of the more conservative groups that represent part of the president's base, that rings a bell with them.
Mm-hmm.
It's a disturbing event for the press, because now it's becoming a tool of the powerful individual to turn the press into an enemy.
Right.
It might spread beyond just that base group that already believe that. It may start affecting the way other people see it.
Absolutely.
Anytime you make the press the enemy, it's like what Vladimir Putin did in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
He made the press the enemy and he took control of it.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way you fix the problem.
And talk about fake news there. Totally controlled. You say this.
Except for that, I would argue that the opposite is actually happening. If we look at some polling data from February 17th, we see that people were rating the current president and the media equally reliable as far as truthfulness.
Mm-hmm.
And even just a few days later, from February 22nd, we have 52% support for the media and only 37% support for the current president.
Mm-hmm.
And
I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I think that's a really good example.
So yes, I think you're right. He may be playing to his base, but those kinds of statements are actually galvanizing support for media and for the press right now. So again, I think it only indicates that the press are doing their job and that people are paying attention.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're playing to the base as much of what the president is these days.
Right, and he can do that easily now with access to social media.
Yeah.
I mean, who would have thought, just even, President Obama would Twitter and do some things like that, or sometimes they have aides do that, quite honestly. They have their aides do, the Twitter feeds and the Facebook feeds. But who would have thought that even just 10 years ago, that we would have the President of the United States tweeting to the constituents across the country directly, having that voice and just actually ignoring the mainstream press in between. I mean, that's just revolutionary in terms of what we always thought in media.
Well, in fact, what Dr. Carriveau was talking about, I wonder what kind of impact that has on public opinion. Are people persuaded by these, or is he just been speaking to his base?
Well, the other thing is that it's rapid reply, so they get to respond back, and that's a power issue. That breaks down that whole hegemony that of the mainstream media. It breaks down the very vertical activity of the media doing top-down, putting out work, and now it's very horizontal. So you've got the president, you've got journalists that have been forced to get into that conversation as well, using not just traditional methods, but also social media, and citizens all together at one time, just rapidly back and forth, shooting these sometimes facts back and forth, and sometimes, mostly, it seems like a lot of it is feelings and opinions.
But is that reinforcing the power structure, or is that, because we call it horizontal? When I was in the computer industry many years ago, they always said our organization was a horizontal organization, meaning power was dissipated.
Very integrated and
I found
interactive.
Actually it was very hierarchical, and it turned out in practice because it worked better.
Mm-hmm.
And likewise, a lot of these appear to be more horizontal power relations, but the president has the power. He's the guy with his finger on the button.
Right.
The Joe and Jane out here and the rest of America don't have that kind of power. And he speaks with authority, and he can get them to do things quite possibly they might not otherwise do. So I wonder what the power structure really is. Maybe it is being dissipated and watered down.
I think it is to some degree. I've seen that a lot. It's kind of like it's used as an organizing tool. I mean, it's a double-edged sword for sure. I mean, you can get people really riled up and get them to do things based upon no facts at all, but just simply feelings and emotion. But you can also disseminate facts through social media. You can disseminate any message that you want, as long as you can stay within the range of characters. For Twitter, it's like 140 characters, and Facebook, you have a little bit more space to write or send a visual message, out there. There's simply platforms, channels of information. Technically, you could say the same message in person as you say on Twitter, but it seems like the psychology behind the use of the technology is that you're hidden behind the technology, and so you tend to be a little bit more abrupt. You say things that maybe you wouldn't say to somebody in person because you're hidden behind the technology of social media. You could say exactly the same thing. I mean, you could get up, you could read a paper in front of people in person, and you could put out part of that paper in print in Facebook. Will it have the same impact? Maybe if it's the same words, but what the tendency is to cut things way back in social media, abbreviate the message, and then sometimes often add some kind of emotion to it that may not be present in a face-to-face situation. I mean, it varies. It can vary all across the board, how you can adjust and spin things however you want,
I just see the president as a powerful person, and he wants to maximize power. That's why I'm suspicious.
Yep.
Between the four of us here, social media would be more egalitarian, perhaps, but you got a powerful person. What's he doing with this power? Is he trying to be informative, helpful? Well, that's the purpose of journalism. He's trying to maximize power. That's why when I heard what he was doing, I knew exactly what he was doing.
Yeah.
He's not trying to inform the public. He's trying to manipulate them.
Right. And it's like, let the journalists do the journalism and let the politicians do the politics. Go do something and do something political instead of having to get out there and do the social media thing.
Like fact check.
Yes.
That the journalists can fact check on Twitter or whatever. I'm not going to take time to fact check maybe.
Right.
I'll take on face value. So the journalists can fact check, can serve as some kind of a filter, vetting stories and finding out if there's some validity.
Triangulation, that's what we talk about all the time. Yeah. Have multiple sources.
But one thing, the president can try to do those things. He can try to manipulate with those messages. But you also find that he has less control over the messaging, because there is that instant response and those retweets and those comments back and subtweets and those kinds of things. And in fact, I've been really amazed. The president will send out a tweet, and then I'll go read the comments underneath, and I am amazed that people are tweeting those comments back to the President of the United States. And I'm thinking, okay, there's this freedom and kind of a breakdown of the hierarchy and the opportunity to say amazing things to the President of the United States.
It doesn't change his actions.
I don't know if it changes his actions, but it certainly changes the way we interact with power.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Well, it's kind of like, if you take the example of the Arab Spring idea, and how a few years ago, people got together in the Middle East and supposedly brought down some of their corrupt governments with the organizing power of social media and had that happen. Of course, like I say, it's a double-edged sword. You put technology in the hands of people and you can do all kinds of things, positive or negative. I mean, you've got ISIS using social media as well, right? And they're organizing in their ways that they orient towards and feel are correct. And so you can use it as an organizing tool, and it certainly does level the playing field of interaction. I mean, the President of the United States with, everyday ordinary citizens sitting in the middle of South Dakota can respond back to that Twitter feed. How do you feel about that as a journalism political science student, Taylor? About the use of social media and how you might see yourself using that into the future, and how you might see it even as a political reporter, example?
I think social media definitely gives politicians and journalists a certain power to put out a message that they want right away, instead of having to wait for the story to get out or get things planned and a broadcast put on or something. And so it's very instantaneous. But also, like, in a point of politicians, it is very, like, when you think of Twitter, or when most people think of Twitter, it's very much younger generations using it and whatnot. And so it almost seemed less powerful just because it's like, oh, they're using Twitter? What? And so I think it's just the message that it could be a powerful message, but just because the way it was represented takes away the power. And so, and also journalists have to be careful of that. You know, there's a lot of stigma with social media. And so if you put out something on Facebook that, you know, might have changed the world or whatever, just with that article, people might not realize how powerful it is because, oh, it's just on Facebook.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. I just want to comment, too, a little bit about some of my best journalism students, I would say, in the past have been or have carried a minor or a double major in political science. And from the point of journalism, political science is traditionally an excellent combination in a major-minor kind of a program at the university level. We consider that a high-level major-minor kind of a situation where this person is really going to go out and do some good work as a journalist. And, you know, it came to light today. Actually, I just got this by email today. It's about a textbook, Freedom of Speech and the History of Ideas. Landmark Cases, Historic Essays, and Recent Developments by the author Vincent Blasi. It's a 2016 edition. But I find even some of the description here of the book made strong connections between political science and journalism by just saying it's about the course book, the accessible and engaging book with a focus on historical developments, basic principles, landmark cases, and contemporary issues without elaborating on the doctrinal matrix in full lawyerly detail is well suited for a political science or journalism school course on the First Amendment. And so just using, I think, political science and journalism in the same sentence kind of shows when I was going, you know, way back when I was thinking about the topic matter, the general theme for this show of connecting good journalism with politics or good political science. It just shows some of the ways of thinking about how journalism and political science can work together, especially even in an academic environment. And I know when I first went to talk to Pamela about doing this show, from my standpoint, I'm very interested in getting our integrated media and journalism students involved with political science, possibly as a minor, as even at least taking those classes as some electives or gen eds, because I think it's very important for journalism students to know politics and the law. And so I strongly feel that although they can't be a journalist and a politician at the same time, but that subject matter certainly does play off of each other. And of course here on campus we have a journalism minor still, and we have a journalism certificate that people can get. And I just think the combination is good, and that at some point we have to consider those connections. And maybe we don't make those connections enough, as much as we should sometimes. Any comments on that, Dr. Martinez or Dr. Carriveau, from your standpoint as academics and professors on campus? Any things that you've noticed, observations in that area between the two?
I actually completely agree with you. While I understand that journalists can't be politicians, going back to what Dr. Van Benthuysen and Dr. Martinez were saying about politicians and political science actually don't go together 100% either, so it's perfectly fine. I think the real value of learning political science is that you learn how the political system actually works so that you're better able to be critical of those things that are told to you by the politicians. You can't deconstruct or criticize or question what they tell you if you don't know how the system works, if you don't know how a policy operates, if you don't know facts about minimum wage and the economy. You just need all of that factual information to be a good critic of the messages that are being sent out by the politicians.
Sometimes been argued that part of the problem with the news media is it presents decontextualized news stories about politics, that they tell you the Supreme Court justice was just approved by the Senate, and you go, of course, isn't that the job of the Senate, simply approve appointments to the Supreme Court? The contextualized story would have told the public that in actuality the president appoints, but the Supreme Court justice does not serve except with the advice and consent of the Senate. In other words, they can accept or reject, for whatever reason under the sun, really, the appointment. So the news media often doesn't do that contextualization. And I think if the student, the journalist had a political science background, they would know this stuff and probably realize why this is important to mention when they tell the news story. And I think by contextualizing the story, it's going to be much more informative, and the public's going to come away with a better understanding of what exactly happened, and won't be misled by politicians and others that wield their power to mislead the public.
Right. And I do think that as something that we discuss in classes in mass communication, we talk about journalists being informal educators on a daily basis. I mean, journalists can tell people everything on a daily basis about what clothes to wear because they report the weather, but they, on the other end of the spectrum, they report politics, and they can actually influence people how to vote. But they can also educate if they have the space in their newspapers, or if they have time in their broadcasts, and they have support from their management to report details about how government is structured, so that they don't leave out those details, that they can inform people and educate people appropriately so that the general citizenry can make educated decisions and educated and informed decisions about, everything from what coat to wear for the day to what president to vote for, right? Comments from you, Taylor, on that? or anything that you thought about before about what we were saying? Let me just boil it down to this. As a journalist, being an informal educator of all kinds of topic matter, but specifically if you're going to be covering political matter, what is that? What can you say about that?
Well, I mean, definitely if a journalist is going to be covering politics or anything, whether you have to have a certain expertise. And so it is important to make sure that you're well educated and know the ins and outs of the policies and procedures. So having that, like earlier you were saying, journalism and political science, it's important to have that background just because people are looking to you to give them information. And so you have to make sure everything is 100% correct and that you know what you're talking about.
Right. Okay.
I also want to build off of something you just said. You don't even have to be a journalist who covers political science or politics, actually. I was thinking about examples of how politics creeps into other areas of journalism, whether we're talking about the Oscars and Oscars So White last year, whether we're talking about the NFL and Deflategate and Roger Goodell and the politics of the NFL, whether we're talking about the science fiction Hugo Awards and the sad puppies and the mad puppies who are trying to use that platform to push their social agenda. A political science background can give you insight and skills to develop or to report all kinds of different things, even beyond studying politics itself.
Right, okay. Reaction to this. We're going to kind of start wrapping up because we're getting in time here, but so I do want to give you a chance, the clearinghouse question of generally, final comments, things that we haven't talked about that you prepared, but I just want to throw out this one more thing. It's from an article, How Political Science Can Help Journalism and Still Let Journalists Be Journalists, by Brendan Nyan and John Sides. The very first sentence of the abstract of the paper says, political scientists frequently lament the media's neglect of our research. And I think that some of that's connected to what we were just talking about, giving more than just a very basic what happened, but adding more information about how this process actually does happen on a step-by-step basis, although knowing that oftentimes we're bounded by time and we're bounded by space. And sometimes bounded by what your editor or your management will ask you to do. Although reporters should have a basic understanding of the field, it is not reasonable to expect them to restate the conclusions of academic research on a daily basis. Moreover, it is not always clear how research findings apply within the conventions of political journalism, which is context-specific and episodic in nature. Any comments in response to that? A little bit more, we're kind of segue off of what we were talking about there. Any comments on that?
So, summarize that a little bit more.
Yeah, let me just reread.
My simple mind to understand.
Yeah, it's okay. Takes a little time to think about it. So the title of the piece is How Political Science Can Help Journalism, and then in parentheses it has, and still let journalists be journalists. And then the first part of the abstract, just a summary. Political scientists frequently lament the media's neglect of our research. Although reporters should have a basic understanding of the field, it is not reasonable to expect them to restate the conclusions of academic research on a daily basis. Moreover, it is not always clear how research findings apply within the conventions of political journalism, which is context-specific and episodic in nature.
Well, I'll say this, something you said in there. It sounds like there's this kind of a critique that is saying that if you're a political science student, you're going to be tied up in all the scholarly research, and that's going to get in the way of you reporting a story that the public
I think that
can-
essentially is it, yes.
When I teach a class in Intro to American Government, I have a lot of background knowledge. I can bring it to bear only to a limited sense. Like, I don't spend a lot of time getting into the details of Madison's Virginia resolution. I might mention it in passing. But I can build on that certain level of knowledge that I don't have to go back to all my deep thoughts and information. I can just give them like a summarized version of it, in the sense that I can help again contextualize what they're seeing before them. Like the fact that Supreme Court justices don't always do what the president who appointed them wanted them to do. And there's still these studies that show that Justice so-and-so was put on by Richard Nixon, and he turned out to be just the opposite of Nixon intended. I don't have to come in and tell my viewers that this is what's going on, but I can allow them to know in a more superficial fashion, perhaps if that's the right word, that justices don't always do what they're supposed, what their presidents who appoint them want them to do.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, you have that background knowledge, and background knowledge, you probably do the same thing when you teach. You have a lot of background knowledge, and you don't give it to the students all, but it does inform what you are telling them.
Mm-hmm. And then at some point, too, students or audience members, in the case of media, can take bits and pieces of information or things that they found interesting, and now they can take it to a level of having impact on their life, or they can do more research themselves.
You could spawn that.
Yeah.
But an example I think of is that I tell my students in my President Congress class that Congress is like a herd of cats making sausage.
Oh, yes.
Good way of putting it.
Yeah.
But that's what it's like. And I can, as a reporter, knowing that, I can help my viewers understand that making legislation is kind of a messy business.
Yeah, it's definitely
That's what
cats
it
making sausage. I love that one.
Yeah,
I was just imagining that. I had a picture in my mind of cat.
Imagine cats can never agree on what they're going to make.
Right, exactly.
Mouse sausage or bird sausage.
Love it. Yep, very good. Comments?
I have a concrete example of this that I think kind of gets to that episodic aspect that you were talking about. We know that when President Trump came in, he issued, it seems like, a large number of executive orders.
Mm-hmm.
And it was covered extensively. It seemed like a lot. Wow, he's really governing by executive order. Well, a political scientist, based on research, would say, okay, yes, there are a lot, but actually he's on track with the type and actually the number of executive orders that President Obama issued.
Mm-hmm.
And both of those were higher than, had more executive orders than did Bush or Clinton.
Okay.
So if you have that background, if you have that political science research behind you, you can say, you know what, I really don't need to write a story about President Trump governing by executive order, given that his executive orders really aren't out of normal.
It's just normal.
Right.
And even along the same lines, and also recognize that a lot of these executive orders are so substantive, they're equivalent to a law that should have been passed by Congress, which makes some scholars kind of go, oh my gosh.
Yep.
So there's, on one hand, we know that this is normal for them to produce so many, and on the other hand, we might say, and that could be a bad thing all along, even though the president's been doing this. They've been doing bad things for a long time.
That's right.
Oh, right. So even a longer story about, explaining all of that would even be more informative than just reporting on the executive orders, but giving all the background. Yeah. That's also related to something that we talk about in a class where we're doing journalism is news value. And so normal sometimes is not news value. So what is normal doesn't need to necessarily be expanded upon or even reported on at some point. Taylor, any comments on that?
I agree with what everybody's saying. It's definitely having that background knowledge will help the journalists decide what story needs to be reported. But like as you said, people are freaking out that Trump is putting in all these executive orders. And so is the story really, is he putting in all these executive orders, or should journalists be saying, no, this is actually normal, because that's not what it's being said.
Right. And that's where it's become very subjective and kind of, raising a lot of questions that maybe don't need to be raised, or raising a lot of anxiety that doesn't need to be raised.
Exactly.
If they were political science students like you are, maybe they'd realize that and wouldn't be freaking out about the wrong thing.
Right. Well, that's why I like this next question that's put in the early on in the same paper. How should reporters incorporate political science research into their day-to-day reporting? Now, that really shows a very strong connection between knowing political science, taking courses in political science, and having background in political science and reading political science literature, and being a journalist. I mean, I think that it specifically addresses a very strong connection. But how would you respond to that? How should reporters incorporate political science research into their day-to-day reporting to make it better, to make it appropriate for audiences to consume and be informed at the level that most citizens should be informed at? I guess that's one of our final questions that we want to discuss here today, and then we'll just wrap it up.
Sounds like very, very hard work. That's what I'd say. A good journalist, I'm sure you can probably attest to this too, put for a small story in the front page of New York Times, I would assume put maybe hours, if not days, of hard work in that story, gathering information, putting, because part of what goes on, I think, is you filter and organize the information you gather, and you then put it on paper or online or whatever, the means of transmission. So that framework, that organizational template, I guess I would call it, is the knowledge you have, and you can put that on paper. And how do you do that? I'm not a journalist. I'm not sure. I can tell you what a teacher does, and maybe it's something similar.
It's a similar process, for sure.
I for a class I'm going to teach an hour and 10 minutes. I have a pile of notes this high, and I have to pour them. People wonder, well, why do you have to look at your notes so much before class? I say, well, because I've got to organize all this stuff in my head, so I don't have to sit there and read off my paper.
I've actually had people say to me, how come you have all those papers in front of you when you do that? Because and they're not an instructor or a teacher or professor, and I have to explain. It's the same thing. It's so much like that. You have a stack of papers, a stack of notes, and you have to condense it way down in an hour and 10-minute class, or in a 500-word report, or something like that. How we have quite the limitations on our word counts. On our, you do a feature story and 400 to 750 words. Your opinion story is about the same. Hard news, 200 to 400 words tops. Very limited by word counts and space, and you have to really condense a bunch of information into a very small space as a journalist. Pamela?
I would like to see political science integrated into journalism by using that information to question common sense. A lot of things that we think are true, or we think it's common sense, this must be the way that things work, it actually isn't true. And if we could find a connection between the journalist and the political scientist who's doing research in this area and say, you know what, we think this is how it is, but it's really not, I think that would be super helpful for citizens who are out there. That could connect academia to everyday reality. And my example of that would be, we assume, and as educators I think we all assume this, that if we could just teach people more, if we could just give them the facts, if we could just show them, here's the research on vaccines, or here's the research on climate change, or here's the research on evolution. If we could just sit them down and get them in our classroom and show them this is how it works, then they would understand and they would vote appropriately, in the sense that they would vote based on science rather than on opinion or myth or whatever. But the real research shows that that's not true. Giving people the facts does not actually change their mind when it comes to voting. And that just is nonsensical. It's non-commonsensical to say giving people the facts won't change their mind. But knowing that, if you know that that's true, you change the way you talk to people, you change the way you
your tone of voice,
policy.
Everything.
Yes. And so I think
your
that's
handshake.
The value, yes, of academia or political science or academic research in general, that to challenge that common sense assumption of how things must work, to actually understand how things really work.
Right. Like commonly I'll hear these days, I voted for that person because they said that one word, or I heard them on the radio and they sounded like me. And that was it. There were no facts. It's totally based on emotion and perception. And it's not based at all on fact, and it's not based upon research. And so that says a lot about human nature, too, and how we interact and make our decisions that way. So we know we can be so easily influenced by certain things. And then there's the whole idea of brainwashing, but that's a totally different topic we could talk about. And I know we've all got to move on. I really appreciate your time here today. I really like this conversation. Any final comments within about 5 minutes that we either related to what we were just talking about or something from a long time ago that you didn't get a chance to fit in, or something that you have on your notes that you have that we haven't talked about at all that you just have to say? Now's the time, and it doesn't matter what order you're in. Elizabeth, if you got anything to say, you can yell it out too. Elizabeth is our research assistant.
I'd actually like to plug mass comm or journalism or graphic design a little bit too. A lot of times political scientists don't know how to easily communicate with people in a way that makes us understood, simplifying concepts, or even just not being weird. And so I really appreciate the work that graphic designers do to take complicated information and turning it into something that is visual and can be understood by looking at it in a way that is consumable. Mm-hmm. And the same thing with journalists. They can take complicated ideas and figure out a way to translate that tendency that political scientists have to not want to take a real position, mm-hmm. and turn it into something that actually is understandable and relatable to by an average reader.
Right.
So I think there's value also for political science to have journalists who are willing to take the stuff that we do and make it real.
Mm-hmm. We commonly call that walking through the fog to get at the facts. And so you can imagine any kind of very complicated situation that you get into, and essentially you're trying to get you're just overwhelmed with all kinds of sensory experiences that are coming at you as a journalist, and you're looking for your 5 facts, your who, what, when, where, why, your primary facts. You're looking for your secondary set of facts, your secondary who, what, when, where, why, and all of that activity that's going on around you. And you're trying to form out your questions so that you can get more details behind those basic facts. And that's what the journalist does all the time. I guess it's very similar to say a student that's sitting in a classroom for the first time, and it's very foggy for sometimes days. Oftentimes, they'll think that they're lost. You hear that. They're lost in the fog. Then all of a sudden things start making sense as they get more information, as they maybe do more research to bring their stories together. Taylor?
Just based on
anything
what you just said, that's just another reason why it's so important to make sure that journalists have that political science background, because it is very hard to understand the political science lingo and all of that. Mm-hmm. And so being able to look at article or research that a political science did and be able to say, oh, this is what this means, and then convey it to the audience, that's just one more reason why it's just so important.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Martinez?
I'd say, there was that saying, agitate, criticize, think. Even scientific theories aren't static. They're a constant change. So even questioning those, but of course, can't be a total cynic.
Right.
Because then that incapacitates you. It makes you unable to operate. But still, I think the ability to be thoughtful, to be critical, and ask questions is a vital part of not just a political scientist, but a journalist, and, of course, most importantly, a citizen. Mm-hmm. If citizens would open their minds and think a little bit, maybe they'd make some better decisions. Mm-hmm. I'm not trying to say, democracy is a messy business. It's not going to make a perfect world. I'm not a utopian. Mm-hmm. So, but it might make a little better world.
Okay. Elizabeth, you want to yell out anything? It's got to be hard sitting there for two hours straight and just, if it were me, I'd be like, I got to grab that microphone.
I guess it makes me feel a little better. I've been grappling personally with what news should I be listening to. Mm-hmm. Is what I listen to biased? Because, of course, I am a little biased. And I feel a little better knowing it is the press's jobs to get in there and dig up controversy and really stir things up, and I guess I don't feel quite so bad for listening to it and myself feeling a little agitated and bringing it up and arguing with people.
And that's so
It's my
interesting to
duty
hear.
as a
Just
citizen.
as a side perspective, I just have to say, Elizabeth Williams, a student here at Black Hills State University, she's doing a research assistantship position for our Media Blitz that's coming up. And so she's been sitting in on some of these sessions to gain an idea of what we do in mass communication and media, because you are a business student. And so it's just interesting to get some perspective from someone that's just kind of sitting in the room and learning about how this all works. It's very insightful to hear from you, just as sort of the fly on the wall. So thanks for being the fly on the wall today.
No,
That's
thank
awesome.
you.
Awesome. So the next thing we'll have you do is coming in here and editing this stuff with me. That's always an interesting process. Okay, well, I want to thank you all today for coming. Dr. Martinez, Taylor Powell, Dr. Carriveau, and Elizabeth Williams, thanks for coming, and really appreciate your expertise and your offerings. I love this conversation. It was great. That's our special topic session for today.